does it mean when a scientist discovers something world changing and history forgets or doesn't even know her name? Today, we're talking about two women in STEM whose work shaped our understanding of climate science and DNA, and the writers who refuse to let their stories stay buried. Let's talk about how we recapture lost history for young readers. Welcome back to Nonfiction Kidlit Craft Conversations, the podcast for writers who want to deepen their craft in nonfiction for young readers. I'm your host, Kirsten Larson. Today's episode brings together three remarkable authors and two powerful YA nonfiction books. Lindsay H. Metcalf joins us with Footeprint, a novel and verse biography of climate scientist Eunice Newton Foote, whose early discoveries about greenhouse gases were overlooked for more than a century. And we have co authors Debbie Loren Dunn and Janet Fox, bringing us The Real Rosalind, the story of Rosalind Franklin, the X ray crystallographer whose work was essential to uncovering the structure of DNA. We're talking research, form, collaboration, emotional complexity, and what happens when history has gaps. Lindsay, Debbie, Janet, welcome.
Thank you.
Yay, happy to be here.
Yeah, and I'm thrilled to have you. All right. So every nonfiction book starts with a moment of recognition, right? When did you first encounter Eunice Newton Foote, Lindsay, or Rosalind Franklin, Debbie and Janet? And when did it shift from, oh, okay, that's interesting history, to I have to write this book? So, Lindsay, what made you have to write Eunice Newton Foote's story?
I keep getting this question and I cannot find the first article that I read about her, but I do know that it was in November of 2021 because I went back and looked at when I emailed my agent, because I remember reading that Eunice had discovered carbon dioxide can warm the atmosphere in excess quantities. And I read that she had been forgotten after this experiment in 1856, and it just blew my mind. I was like, why are there no books about this woman? There weren't even traditionally published adult books. So I emailed my agent the next day and I said, I've got to write this. So at that point, I thought I was writing a picture book, but I was not. I was writing a novel in verse.
which we will talk about later, because I think a lot of us start out with an intention to write a picture book and then have to think, is this the right way to go? So we're going to talk about that in a minute. Awesome. All right. And Debbie and Janet, what about you two? What was the first moment when you encountered Rosalind Franklin, and then what tipped you over into, we have to do this?
It's embarrassing to say, but it was 14 years ago. My daughter told me she was in med school, and she told me about this woman, Rosalind Franklin, who had kind of been looked over and treated poorly, but she's the one that actually proved that DNA is the double helix. And so I started reading about her, and there are some light picture books, but they don't tell the story is not not a good night story, you know. So I just knew then, and I did write it as a picture book, but we can talk about that later, what happened.
Okay, awesome. Let's just go into it. So Debbie, we'll start there. You tried it as a picture book because you have written picture books. So what made you want to try it as a picture book? And then what was for you the turning point where you're like, this is not going to be the way to go?
Well, the story itself, as I wrote it, I didn't feel like it was super duper uplifting at the end, but I feel like it's a story that everyone needs to know. And I also wanted to tell all of her discoveries. So she had 3 groundbreaking discoveries that were worthy of Nobel Prizes, and she didn't get credit for any of those. And so it just didn't lend itself. I mean, I tried to squish it in there and be tight, but it just did not work out. And plus, it's not a good night story, really. So.
Yeah, Janet, did you have anything to add to that?
Sure. Debbie invited me into the project after she had shifted from the picture book into writing it as a full biography. And I was thrilled to be invited and knew nothing about Rosalind. And I have a science background. My husband is a scientist. So I asked him, I said, what do you think about this? He said, oh my God, it had to be written. You have to help with this. So I came in after Debbie had actually written a full draft, and I sprinkled some fairy dust on Debbie's extraordinary research, because I write fiction, and this story lent itself to kind of humanizing Rosalind as and she was a really interesting person beyond her science, and so that's really what I was doing, was bringing more of the character development into the story and the emotional impact that she had on her colleagues as well as the world. It was a real pleasure. And it's definitely not a bedtime story, as Debbie said. It begs for that big picture look. Yeah.
Well, and I think you all are speaking to a couple of things, right? I mean, with picture books, we have such a narrow focus, right? We can really only focus on one thing, and you're
Mm.
talking about an incredibly nuanced person. Lindsay, so you also are known as an author of picture book biographies of women in STEM. So what was the shift for you? What did YA allow you to do that a picture book couldn't?
Well, as I was starting my research, I thought I was doing a picture book, and I always start an unknown figure with a timeline. So I'm pulling things from different sources and I'm just dumping them all into a document, trying to figure out what's what. And the more I researched, well, my first problem was, is there enough information about this woman? Because no one's written about her. So I'm pulling and pulling and pulling. And I realized that not only has she made this discovery about carbon dioxide, but she was instrumental in the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls. She lived in Seneca Falls, was friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and there were other layers too. It was happening during the nascence of industrialization, and she was also an inventor. Her husband became the US patent commissioner, and he was approving these inventions for fossil fuel, you know, engines and things like that. And so there were all these layers that were conflicting and working together also. And I just knew that it would not do it justice the way I wanted to tell it as a picture book. And it so happens that the big magic with that was out there, and there are 2 other picture books about Eunice Newton Foote that have just released. So it could be done. It was just not the way I wanted to tell it.
Yeah. Well, and that's really interesting because I ran into that with my book that's going to be a graphic novel, which started as a picture book. And somebody else has done a picture book about Rose Valland, but I couldn't figure it out how to do with the story that
Mhm.
I wanted to tell. So again, it's a very personal choice,
Very
right?
much.
And you have to
Yeah.
adhere to what you want to tell. Let's pivot a little bit to research. So, YA nonfiction requires extensive research. Obviously, you're kind of building out scenes, probably in a little bit more detail than you might in a picture book. There's a lot of emotional nuance. And then you have the layer of science, which you have to kind of explain possibly at a higher level than you would in a picture book. So, Janet and Debbie, I'll start with you. Like, where did you begin your research? And then what sources were kind of most valuable players for you in helping you get Rosalind on the page?
Go ahead, Debbie. You're the research
Yeah,
person here.
I couldn't stop researching. Thank
Who
goodness for
who
Janet. It's like
can? Who can?
so much fun. But there was a lot out there, but it wasn't accurate. And I could
Mm,
tell it wasn't. She had these other discoveries. Nobody was talking about it. I ended up going and finding her archives, which her best friend had taken all of her lab notebooks, her letters, her personal letters to all of her acquaintances, because that's what they did then. They wrote letters in 1950. And she had them all there categorized, and it was in Baltimore at University of Maryland at Baltimore in the stacks. So I went in and I put on the white gloves and I got to hold these things, and it was fabulous, and I was hooked even more. And then I realized the story has even more depth, blah, blah, blah. I ended up going to London to visit really where she was when this was happening. And the Wellcome Trust, it's with 2 L's, Welcome with 2 L's. That trust has a lot of her items also. The actual x-ray machines that she used and those kinds of things. So I got to go see that, and I got to go in the back because they didn't have it out front in some of the museums. So
Well, and in terms of like explaining the science, because your book has like these little interstitials, right, where you kind of explain the science behind DNA. What kind of sources were you pulling on for that information?
So I found a couple of books by doctors. They were a little bit dry, and I would have to call my daughter every now and then.
I love it.
What are they saying? And then, I watched a lot about it's really, if you could explain X-ray crystallography, I think then you could explain what she was doing. And so that was the challenge, getting that down. And Janet had to rewrite it for me a couple times. I was way too detailed. Just couldn't help myself. It was a lot of fun, but to write that level, you really have to know when to stop. And Janet was really my stopgap for that. It was awesome.
So Janet, how do you know when to stop? Because I don't think I always have a hard time with this too. I want your tips. How do we know when to stop?
That's a great question. Well, having a science background really helped because I could discern what was too complicated or involved for perhaps the YA audience, since we're trying to reach the YA audience here, and knew that if we got too in the weeds with something, we lose them. So it was a matter of pulling back just enough, but keeping the truth of the science, and then having that embedded in her emotional arc as well, which was the key. And that's sort of where I came in, because that's what I do all the time with fiction. And so Debbie had all of the details, had all of it beautifully laid out, but just pulling back a little bit, just taking some of the language and massaging it until it was reaching that young reader that might get lost in the weeds if we were too detailed. But Debbie had it all there. It was all ready to go. Just needed a little, you know, shifting around.
Janet made it palatable, is what she's trying to say.
It's like you have your own built-in critique partner or developmental editor. I love it.
It was
It was a
so
great
great.
collaboration.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
we
love
loved
it.
it.
I love it.
We
It was perfect.
were sad when the final came, it was out. It was like, it was in awe, but it was just so much fun working on it with
It was
Janet.
pretty seamless. I mean, yeah, it was pretty seamless. We both had, knew what our strengths were, and we meshed perfectly, I thought. So,
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
we stayed in our lanes.
Yeah.
that's great. Well, and we can talk about that in a little more detail in a minute.
Sure.
If you're looking for more than just isolated writing tips, Reimagine Insiders might be the right next step. In 2026, the Insiders community is working together on one children's nonfiction project across the entire year. Through monthly craft posts and group coaching calls, we move step by step from generating and vetting story ideas to drafting, revising, and shaping a submission ready manuscript. It's designed for writers who want structure, momentum, and thoughtful guidance on their projects throughout the year. And you can join anytime. All past posts and calls are accessible in the membership area. You can learn more about Reimagine Insiders at writers.kirstenwlarson.com. So,
Yeah.
Lindsay, with research, it sounds like you had a big challenge, right? No adult biographies on the topic of Eunice Newton Foote. And now you're working at multiple layers because you're telling her story. You have to talk about the women's suffrage movement, you have to talk about the science. So, tell me a little bit of your research process and what sources were really your gold mines.
Because I approach this in poems, I sort of think of it as writing a lot of different picture books,
Mm.
because it was like puzzling pieces out and using economy of words. But research wise, you're right. I was attacking it from different levels because honestly, that helped me find more information about her. Opening up to suffrage, there's a lot of resources about the women's suffrage movement and specifically the Seneca Falls Convention. So I started there. I would read secondary sources and then go back to the primary sources listed in the bibliographies. I had a work trip scheduled to Washington, D.C. for another book, and I realized that there is an archive that holds a few of Eunice's letters. It's her daughter, Mary Foote Henderson. She was a big Washington socialite. And so she has an archive at the Smithsonian Institution Archives. There are a handful of letters back and forth from Eunice and her family, and I got to hold those as well. And so that was one of the reasons I wanted to expand it as a birth to death book, because those letters, I had her voice, but it was during the time period when she was a grandmother and not when she was doing all this other cool stuff. So I got to kind of put it all in. And then I backtracked after I'd already written the manuscript. I had, pulled pieces from various experts who were helping me find sources from different archives and museums and whatever. But then I put it all together and took a trip through upstate New York where Eunice grew up and went to school and did her experiments. And just meeting with people and seeing those places helped unlock the humanity of it all, I think. I got to see her childhood home, but, had to piece together primary source records and figure out which one this was. And she had invented a wood stove in 1842, and I'm pretty sure I found the version of her stove in Seneca Falls, which was so cool. It wasn't labeled as that. I found the very court case where her husband, he was an attorney working on saving her family farm. I had read, oh, well, she met her husband because he was helping save the family farm. But until I had that document, I couldn't put it in my book. And I was able to find it by working with a local county archive. So just things like that really helped put everything together for me.
Well, and then you are doing something very difficult, which is you are writing in poetry, right? And poetry is really focused on moments in time, lots of sensory details. So tell us a little bit about the choice to actually do this as a novel in verse instead of just a straight YA biography. Why was this the right choice for you and for Eunice?
Don't hate me when I say this, but I did it because it was easier.
Okay, I
No, it's
believe.
not.
Okay, but for context, you are a poet,
I don't
right?
know. I mean, I do write poetry. I don't know if I am a poet.
You're a published poet in No World Too Big,
Yeah, I have
No
I
Place
have
Too
published
Small. Yeah.
poetry anthologies and stuff. No, but I was piecing together her life, and there were still a lot of huge gaps where I didn't have any idea what was going on in her life. Sometimes months, sometimes years. And as I was trying to figure out how do I weave this into a narrative that makes sense, I realized that poems could help with those transitions. You're providing a snapshot in time with a poem. So not only are you just zooming in on something, but you're providing the emotion around it. But I didn't want to make up the emotion, so I used metaphor to sort of have the reader bring their emotion to it. And in the huge gaps where I really didn't know what was going on, I would write contextual history about, what was going on with the women's rights movement, or, she's taking a trip through the South to see her daughter, and, what is she wearing? So I wrote about, the layers of her dress and all that binds a woman in the 1860s. And so there was that metaphor and, just filling in gaps that way. But I felt like poetry made that a lot easier for me. And I did end up writing it straight nonfiction because as I was going through, there were just times where I really wanted to make a connection that I did not have proof of. Like in Seneca Falls, I give this example a lot. When she reads about the Women's Rights Convention and she finds out that it's happening, I don't know that she read that news article. but I know the article existed, and I know that she went, and I know that she was influential in the convention. So, I made that connection. And then in the back of the book, I sort of delineated what I made up and what I didn't. And I would say 98% of what's in the book is not made up.
Yeah, well, you know what? That is such a fascinating way to think about it. I love that idea of like having these little poems, as snapshots in time, especially when maybe there are a lot of gaps. I mean, what a
Mhm.
great way of thinking about it. And I mean, what do you think that reading experience is for the reader, right? So the reading experience of a YA novel in verse is very different than like a straight a nonfiction. What kind of feedback have you gotten on the fact that it's these little kind of bite-sized chunks?
The majority of people who've read it so far have not been familiar with the novel in verse format.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
yeah, I'm noticing a lot of the reviews online are like, well, I wasn't sure what to expect, but I really liked it. And the trade reviews are fortunately glowing, which has never really happened. So it's been a really fun way to bring her as a person to the very forefront where you can experience her day to day. I think that white space is helping people really move through the book quickly, but also the poems bring you into these tiny moments where it makes it feel so real.
Right, and there's a lot of emotional connection. Yeah.
Mhm.
All right, so let's pivot back to this idea of co-authoring. So I think what really intrigued me is, Debbie, when you said that you both are good at staying in your lane. So how does your collaboration actually work, and what are those lanes?
Well, quickly, my lane is the research and then writing it out. And like Janet said, she pretties it up way more, but she also does more than that. She puts the heart of it, the soul of it into it, or asks me more questions to kind of bring it out. And I'll let Janet talk about how we actually worked because that's interesting too. But we really didn't disagree ever. She would just explain why we shouldn't be, going into depth this much. And I would be explaining why we can't say it that easy, because we're misleading. And so it was just a great yin and yang. It was
It
just
was.
so fun.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
worked beautifully. Unlike Lindsay's experience, we had the benefit of having lots and lots of contemporary quotes about Rosalind as well as her letters. So we could really put flesh on the bones right through her life. In fact, when we first started working, Debbie had a cradle to grave approach to the story, which I thought was great. But my agent who read it first said, no, don't do that. So don't do it that way. So she wanted to narrow it down to the science that Rosalind did. And very quickly we established, because Debbie had this full manuscript, she would send me a chapter and I would just really consider myself an editor more than anything. I would edit it. And I did read the research materials that Debbie had, especially the secondary sources. There were really great biographies of Rosalind from the point of view of a friend and her family, and some of the other work that was easily accessible. So I could get a sense of her character. And as I would edit Debbie's factual material, I would also layer in some of the more emotional moments that she had so that it became a real true story of a person who was pushed aside by the male establishment at the time, who had some love interests, because of course love interests, everybody loves love interests, especially YA readers. and and so to be able to pull some of those in, her family experiences, and then her very untimely death. And so we literally went back and forth. Debbie would send me a chapter, I'd massage it, send it back to her, and so on, back and forth, back and forth. And it was really seamless. I mean, I felt it was seamless and easy and lovely and fun.
Ah,
So yeah. And we met every week and talked about what we'd done that previous week, and go through anything that wasn't working quite right. And yeah, it
Yeah.
was it was great.
now you all are making me want to find a writing partner.
Oh, it's
It was
fun. It's
so much
Fun.
fun.
highly,
It's so
highly
fun.
recommend it.
I do. It's if you find the right person, and I was just very lucky because I didn't know Janet very well. Maybe I knew her from SCBWI
Yeah.
as a distant name, but it was just, you know, we had the same work ethic and it clicked. We respected each other, what we were doing.
Yep.
And that's what kind of mean by staying in your lane. So it was just great. I feel really, really lucky. It would not be a book without Jen.
Right.
Great.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
And,
perfect.
and Lindsay, I know you've done a lot of collaborative projects, particularly your picture books like No Voice Too Small, and you've done some poetry anthologies. Do you have any thoughts on working on these collaborative projects and what makes them come together?
So I've worked with two other people on these books, Keela Dawson and Jeanette Bradley. And our experience has been a little bit different because we talk about it like a huge group project, really, because there's the three of us. We're calling ourselves co-editors, and we're also bringing in poets, 14 per book, and then we're also having those poets feature young activists, and we're getting permissions from all those young activists. So ours always starts out with a huge spreadsheet, and we just divide things up in that way. We talk about who's going to contact who and keep track of the permissions that we've gathered and check in periodically, sometimes once a week, sometimes once a month. And then when it comes to writing and editing, we usually divide it up and have each of us write, a certain number of chunks. And then we all get our hands in all of the pieces and make comments. And at the very end, we're on the phone together, editing all at the same time. And it's just so much fun.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
it
it
sounds
is.
like a very complicated project management situation. Like
Absolutely.
I could like see the project management board.
Luckily, Jeanette is very type A in the way that she handles spreadsheets. So she keeps us very, you know, lined up as far as all of the data, and she makes sure that the spreadsheets make sense. So,
I love it. All right, so both of you are writing about women who are lost to history, kind of in different ways, right? Like Rosalind, we've heard of her, but her contributions were discounted. Eunice Newton Foote, a lot of us have never even heard this story. So, how do you navigate like kind of presenting this injustice without overwhelming teen readers? And what do you want them to take away from this injustice? Debbie and Janet, we'll start with you.
I couldn't get over it. At first. I was mad. I was mad, mad, mad. But the more I read it, I realized, oh, she is doing this for the love of science. She loves science this much. She's so fascinated by it that she could put out all that other noise. It's kind of like when you're writing a book, you're doing it because you love that subject. And she knew from, that's why it was at first Cradle of Grave, because it was so fascinating. And it probably is with so many subjects, the parallel between their childhood and their, and what they've accomplished in their adult life. But it was crazy because she really could care less what other people thought. At first I thought, that's just a shell. She really, but for her to go through 3 different discoveries like that, but the DNA was the one that was the most egregious, I would have to say. And the other places she was very well accepted. So she's in the middle. She had this, she was very well accepted at a French lab. Then she went to this, London lab and she was not. And but the topic was so crazy. It was so good to her, the DNA, and really unraveling this. And so she kind of stuck with it and just had to tune out. And I was just so impressed by that it was never, ever about the accolades, ever. And that's how I got around it, at least, because at first I was kind of, but this isn't fair, et cetera, et cetera. But she was happy.
Yeah, she loved what she did. She really, truly loved science and loved the outcome of finding something. And so she was constantly searching for answers and not worrying about the competition that the men all around her were engaged in. And for me, coming into this project after Debbie had done all the research, again, from my science background and from, my husband's science background saying, oh, you've got to do this. The thing that drove me forward was seeing all of the misinformation about Rosalind's contribution, especially in the DNA realm. I mean, she was known for for what she did in carbon crystallography. She was sort of known for what she did in mRNA, by the way, in RNA discoveries, but not really acknowledged for her contribution to DNA. And it's still persists in the scientific world, the recognition of what she actually did. So for me, after I read Debbie's first draft, I thought, oh yeah, this is just ridiculous. We've got to let people know, and especially young women in high school, coming up through high school and in the STEM sciences, that there is a platform for them to stand on, and that Rosalind's example provides it. So,
That's great.
push on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really strong takeaway. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Debbie.
That's actually how we sold it. Was the editor had so many teenager daughters,
Mm.
and she said, I want them to read this story,
Right.
and that's what kind of got it into being a
Right.
book.
Yeah. What about you, Lindsay? I mean, how did you deal with navigating the injustice and making sure that it has kind of something inspirational for readers today? How did you figure that out?
Eunice's discovery, like I said, was in 1856. And then 3 years later, a man named John Tyndall made the same discovery about carbon dioxide. And now he is crowned the father of climate science. He's got glaciers named after him and buildings, and, his name is everywhere. Did she know that was going to happen? No, but she was familiar with this person. And her name sort of dropped off after she did her inventing in the 60s, 1860s. And then a man in 2011 who collected a bunch of old science journals was kind of paging through one. He pulled off the shelf and saw this report that Eunice had done about carbon dioxide and realized that it happened 3 years earlier than John Tyndall. So he wrote an article. And that's the only reason that we as a society know who she is. I mean, there have been more researchers since then. So, yeah, as I was doing my research about her, I realized that she was really great at pivoting and navigating the barriers.
Mm.
In
Mm.
1842, I said she invented this stove, but the big barrier there was that she was a married woman and was not allowed to hold a patent in New York State. And so they put the stove in her husband's name. But we know it was hers because she was talking to Amelia Bloomer, or one of the reporters at her newspaper, and was talking about her stove. So that was one example. And then, as this women's rights convention is coming up, the American Association for the Advancement of Science is also being formed. And she and her husband are both really tuned into what's happening in science at the time. And she knows that they're not admitting women. So what does she do? She decides that she's going to help women get rights, just overall, so that she can practice science. And she's navigating these pivots and, just doing what she can because she knows she has ideas to share with the world. And she's doing whatever it takes to get those in front of people. That carbon dioxide paper did get presented at the AAAS convention, but it had to be presented by a man.
Right.
And who did she have present it but the first director of the Smithsonian, Joseph Henry? And so she, had the best connection that she could have, and she got it out there as far as she could get it. I think that's the message, is that yes, there were barriers, but there are ways to achieve your dreams and your goals, even if there are things that conspire to stop you. It's like writing. If you know you believe in a story and you get rejected, you don't just put it away. Well, the people who get published don't just put it away.
Right.
They
Right.
send it out again, or they revise it,
Yes.
or they take feedback from people. And, Eunice was really doing that with her science and her inventions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Both of these stories hold such compelling messages not just for girls and women, but for all kids, right? Because
Mhm.
all teens are going to encounter somebody who's telling them no, or not you, or not now. And so these books just provide beautiful models for how to work around and do what you need to do and share your gifts with the world. So they're just great, and I highly recommend them. So, just one more final question. So, a lot of people, myself included, start our nonfiction journeys with picture books. So, for those who are considering a move to longer nonfiction, maybe middle grade, maybe young adult, what is one shift or the biggest shift that you think authors need to make, either in mindset or with their process?
Mm.
I think it's just they need to know that there is some place for all that material because everyone, no matter what you do, no matter whether it's a novel or I mean a YA, you still have information, left over, and you're like, oh, that's so good. So it gives you a chance to really sit down and slow it down just a little bit so that you really can tell the whole can tell the good parts, that you wouldn't be able to put in a picture book. And I wouldn't have done it without Janet because she made me able to do this or to believe in it. But it seems scary for someone that writes picture books. I could do 2,000 words, but what?
Right, right.
I love how you
Janet?
say slow it down though, because that's exactly what it is.
Oh,
You are spending probably a longer amount of time researching and a longer amount of time writing. But the key is to find that story that you're just obsessed with so that it propels you through that whole process. I mean, if you love the subject enough, which I was totally obsessed with Eunice.
What's a gorgeous
um,
cover?
yeah, I
Mm.
mean, you're not going to give up until you have it done.
right, right. I think that's true. And I think it's also the audience, because for picture books, you're talking to little ones who can only absorb so much. So you have to really parse the details and make it appealing in a different way. Then for the young adult audience, you can put in layers and layers of, especially character, emotional arc, personal experience, who this person was at a deeper level than for a picture book. So it's a really different format. You have to put on a completely different hat. Think of the audience first and foremost, because I think that's where the relationship comes between the author and the reader.
This is gonna sound weird, but I think when I was writing, the audience was me because
Ah,
I felt
yeah,
so free writing whatever I wanted to write about her, instead of trying to condense and condense and condense. I was like,
yeah.
oh, I can spend pages writing about this one topic. What? And it just felt
Yeah.
freeing. And after I was done, I read through everything and realized, oh, at the time I thought it was a middle grade, and then worked with an editor and she thought it was a middle grade, and then I got the contract and it said YA. So sometimes that's how it works out.
Right, right. Well, Lindsay, Debbie, Janet, thank you. This has been such a wonderful conversation about craft, courage, and reclaiming history. So, Footprint by Lindsay H. Metcalf is available from Charles Bridge Teen. The Real Rosalind by Debbie Loren Dunn and Janet Fox is available from Zest Books, and I'll put links in the comments. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe here on YouTube, leave a comment telling us your biggest takeaway, and share this with a writer friend who's ready to level up their nonfiction craft. I'll see you next time on Nonfiction Kidlit Craft Conversations.